Dateline, Northern France, 1415 AD. The on-again, off-again 100 Years' War that has trundled on since 1336 has reignited on a battlefield south of Calais. After several decades of relative peace, the English had renewed their war effort in 1415 amid the failure of negotiations over the rightful heir to the throne of France. King Henry V of England personally led his troops into battle against a vastly numerically superior French force. Despite the disadvantage, the following battle ended in an overwhelming tactical victory for the English, which highlighted the strength of the English longbow against heavily armored knights. Early in 1415, King Henry V of England persuaded Parliament to sanction a war with France over his claim to the French throne. 4 months later, Henry's army landed in northern France, and they immediately besieged the port of Harfleur. The siege took much longer than expected, and a chunk of his army had been lost to disease in the interim, so Henry decided to march his army to overwinter in the friendly city of Calais. The French, meanwhile, had raised an army during the siege, but decided to delay battle and shadow Henry's army as it moved, in the hopes of calling more local nobles to join the fight. By the 24th of October, both armies faced each other for battle, but the French declined, hoping for arrival of more troops. The next day, the French initiated negotiations as a delaying tactic, but Henry ordered his army to advance and to start a battle that, given the state of his army, he would have preferred to avoid, or to fight defensively. The English had very little food, had marched 260 miles in 2.5 weeks, were suffering from sickness such as dysentery, and by now faced much larger numbers of well-equipped French men-at-arms. The French army blocked Henry's way to the safety of Calais, however, and delaying battle would only further weaken his tired army and allow more French troops to arrive. Henry deployed his army, approximately 1,500 men-at-arms and 7,000 longbowmen, across a large pass flanked between two hills. The English men-at-arms in plate and mail were placed shoulder to shoulder 4 deep, while the English and Welsh archers on the flanks drove pointed wooden stakes into the ground at an angle to stop any potential cavalry charges. On the French side were 8,000 armored men-at-arms, 4,000 archers, and 1,500 crossbowmen in the first line alone, with 2 wings of 600 and 800 mounted knights respectively. Exactly how big each army was is up for debate, but it is generally thought that the English were outnumbered by at least 2 to 1, and by as much as 6 to 1. To fully understand the course the battle took, it's important to understand how big a role the terrain of the battlefield played. We go now to Hank, our terrain expert in the field. Thanks, Yank. I'm standing here in the middle of the battlefield of Agincourt, where the ground is a veritable quagmire. The field here was plowed just before the battle, and there had recently been heavy rain, leaving it very muddy, which proved quite tiring for the French knights to walk through in 60 pounds of full plate armor. They even sank up to their knees in some places. Even I'm sinking just standing here. The deep soft mud here particularly favored the lightly armored English force, because once knocked to the ground, the heavily armored French knights had a hard time getting back up to fight. Some knights, encumbered by their armor, actually drowned in their helmets. Adding to that, so great was the undisciplined violence and pressure of the mass of men, that many stumbled over the dead, while others still fell on top of those that were still living on top of the dead, and then they had other guys fall on top of them, and they were suffocated, and they stunk into the ground, and other guys fell on top of them, and they smothered. The French were still expecting more troops to arrive, so were happy to wait, and force the English to attack or flee the field. Even though Henry knew as well as the French did that his army would perform better on the defensive, he was eventually forced to take a calculated risk and move his army further forward to start the battle, which he did with a volley of arrows. This act took the French knights by surprise, who, despite being somewhat disorganized and not at full numbers, charged towards the longbowmen, but it was a disaster, with the French knights unable to outflank the longbowmen, because of the woodland on their flanks, and unable to charge through the forest of sharpened stakes that protected the archers from the front. All the while, the archers continued to fire, and during the retreat, the wounded and panicking horses galloped through the advancing French infantry, scattering them and trampling down in their headlong flight from the battlefield. The mounted charge and subsequent retreat also churned up the already muddy terrain between the French and the English that the French infantry were soon to cross. The heavy steel plate armor of the French men-at-arms allowed them to close the 300 yards or so of thick mud to the English lines, while being under what the French monk of Saint-Denis described as a terrifying hail of arrow shot. To protect themselves as much as possible from the arrows, the French had to lower their visors and bend their helmeted heads to avoid being shot in the face. The eye and ear holes in their helmets were among the weakest points in the armor. This head-lowered position restricted both their breathing and their vision. The surviving French men-at-arms reached the front of the English line and pushed it back, with the longbowmen on the flanks continuing to shoot at point-blank range. When the archers ran out of arrows, they dropped their bows and started using hatchets, swords, and mallets they had used to drive their stakes in, attacked the now disoriented, disordered, fatigued, and wounded French men-at-arms massed in front of them. The French could not cope with the thousands of lightly armored longbowmen assailants, who were much less hindered by the mud and weight of their armor, combined with the English men-at-arms. The impact of thousands of arrows, combined with the slog and heavy armor through the mud, the heat and lack of oxygen in plate armor with the visor down, and the crush of their numbers meant the French men-at-arms could scarcely lift their weapons when they finally engaged the English line. King Henry himself was directly involved in the hand-to-hand fighting, and received an axe blow to the head, which knocked off a piece of the crown that formed part of his helmet, but did no other damage. Over 3 hours of exhausting fighting, both lines of the French men-at-arms were taken prisoner or killed in the thousands. The Battle of Agincourt has already gone down as one of the most stunning victories in English history. The most widely used estimates put the English casualties at about 450, while the lowest French estimate put their own dead at around 4,000, a ratio of over 10 to 1 if the prisoners are included. Beyond the numbers, the battle decimated the noble class of France. 3 dukes, at least 8 counts, a viscount, and an archbishop died, along with numerous other lords. The Battle of Agincourt cut a swathe through the French nobility, taking them hundreds of years to recover from, and reignited the 100 Years' War in a major way. It remains to be seen the effect this battle has on the overall war, and the effect it has on Henry V's claim to the French throne. We'll keep you posted, however, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching.